A big warm welcome and a huge good evening to everyone, and thank you all for joining us. I have great pleasure to introduce Joel and Sari, his wife, Poremba. Joel wrote the book that we're going to review tonight. My name is Staszek Surdel, about his father, Nathan Poremba. As it says in the foreword, we learn how a 9-year-old boy survived on his own in a world full of darkness and death. He refused to be a victim and he resisted his tormentors. Joel, if I may, without spoiling what you're going to be saying, hand over to you now.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Sophie Greenfield, and thank you to Yad Vashem UK Foundation for hosting me and the memoir that I've written about my dad's survival. When the war started in 1939, my dad was 9 years old, and at a very early and unfortunate age, he had to learn to deal with untold adversity and the death of both of his parents and having to find a way to survive. He never gave up and he never gave in, and he didn't let any of life's uncertainties dissuade him. He didn't know how long the war or the Holocaust would last. He just took one day at a time and kept plowing forward. It's an untold story of a little boy that survived, and unlike many Holocaust stories, this one it chronicles the most common survivor of the Holocaust, and that is my father was a flight survivor. He was on the run, hiding, running, dodging, and using a false identity, and hence the name of the book, Staszek Surdel. And that is part of the reason he was able to survive. As we all know, women and children, Jewish women and children, were the #1 targets of the Third Reich. And had my father ever been caught, it would have been the end of him. As we know, 9 out of 10 Jewish children in Europe were slaughtered during the Holocaust. My father definitely had survivor's guilt, just like any victim of trauma that makes it through, while others do not. You are often left with the feeling of, why me? What did I do to survive? What is it that I did that other people did more of and they were unable to survive, but I was? And I grew up in a house where that was kind of a muted emotion that my father didn't share. But for me, as the son of a survivor, I grew up burdened with something a little bit different, and that was, how is it that I was granted life? Because without the Holocaust, the undeniable truth is I wouldn't have been born. As everybody knows, Poland, particularly Krakow, was the arguable center of the Jewish world. There was no state of Israel yet. What Polish Jew would have left and gone to the United States or Canada or England? Hardly anyone, because like I said, it was the center of Jewish life. So without the Holocaust, my father would likely never have left and come to New York and then eventually Los Angeles and met my mother. And it's always been a difficult thing for me to confront. So when I spoke to my rabbi, Yisrael Siner, on an Israel trip in 2018, I discussed these feelings with him, and he said to me, your focus is all wrong. You are not the product of a tragedy. You are not the product of the Holocaust. You are the product of your father's triumph. And that little tweak, as simple as it sounds, meant a lot to me. And it enabled me to move forward and finally sit down with my father and get his story. This story has taken over 51 years to put into book form. For the first 31 years of my life, I chased my father around the house. I wanted to know how he survived, what was his story, and he was not ready to talk. This is my father's family. Those are my grandparents on the ends, Gustava and Joseph Poremba. My dad's 3 sisters that did not survive in the back, Esta, Sala, and Talia. And in the front, my father, the only boy, and the youngest sister, Fella or Felicia that survived with him. So this picture was in our house growing up, and I would always bring my father to it and ask him, who are these people? They're your aunts, they're your grandparents. Well, where are they? And he would explain, but he wouldn't explain anything more than, well, they died during the Holocaust. Then Schindler's List came out, and when we left the theater for the very first time, my father actually revealed something. He said, I used to sneak in and out of the Krakow ghetto with the Schindler Jews, except we didn't know that that's what they were called, and we didn't know where they were going. I only knew that they were going to work. But because of the commotion and the large number of people coming in and out, he timed his comings and goings to the large groups comings and goings. At one point, the group was as large as 1,200 people, and at its smallest, around 600. But my father, at the age of 12, figured out that was his way in and out every day. But that's, my father stopped. He didn't want to reveal anything else. 6 years later, he finally booked a date with the USC Shoah Foundation, which was the foundation that Steven Spielberg founded to collect testimony of survivors and witnesses. And my father finally did that. He had a small group of survivor friends, almost all of whom were Polish. And one by one, over the 6 years from the date of the movie to the time they would eventually sit down and give their testimony, they all did it. And my dad was very last. They were in the house for about 7 hours. My dad provided about 4 hours of testimony. And I grew restless during the interview and wandered around the house. And at two different points, I put my ear up to a door and I heard two pieces of information that I had never heard before. And I talk about both of them in the book. They individually and together absolutely paralyzed me. To hear my father divulge what he divulged in just two specific stories absolutely frightened me from hearing anything further. So whereas the interview process was very liberating for my dad, in that afterwards he was all loosey-goosey. He wanted to talk about his experience. He wanted to share. But I shut down. And so for the next 21 years, the shoe was on the other foot. He was chasing me around to tell his story, and I couldn't bear to hear more. And I'll tell you the two stories that I heard. I first heard my father talk about the Gestapo picking up his sister. At that point in 1942, my father and his youngest sister had false papers. My father's said Staszek Surdel, and my aunt's said Zosia Surdel. And they were two Polish siblings who had been killed in 1939 during the Blitzkrieg, the invasion by the Germans in September. And a cousin of my father's purchased those two false papers from a priest in Krakow. So my father detailed how rumor after rumor led to my aunt's arrest, and the Gestapo picked her up and they tortured her for weeks, psychologically, physically, emotionally. And when he detailed how they used to take her into a courtyard with other so-called prisoners, they tied them to a post and they blindfolded them, and they would shoot and kill everyone except for my aunt because they were trying to psychologically torture her into admitting that she was a Jew. So to hear my father recount that, and I go into much more detail in the book, that was hard to hear. Then an hour or so later, I poked my head out again. I heard my father describing how he decided to leave the family home in August of 1942. The rumors were going around about this thing called liquidating ghettos and deportations of Jews from cities. And the rumor was that my father's city was soon to be deported to some resettled area. My father was 12 years old, and he believed these rumors, and he went up to his mother and he said, "I'm leaving, I want to live." And what was my grandmother going to say? So my father walked out the door with his youngest sister, and my grandmother let them go. She didn't know what she was sending them out to. Was it going to be worse or better? But that ended up saving both of their lives. So to hear my dad recount in 1998 how he said goodbye to his mother in 1942 at the age of 12, not knowing that that was the last time he was going to see her was very difficult for me to hear him emote. Velichka in August 1942 was deported to the death camp Belzec. Of course, no one knew why they were getting on trains, but that's what happened in August of 42. So it took me 21 years to finally sit down and watch my dad's video, the USC Show Up Foundation video's testimony. And that cracked the bubble. And I was able to confront my dad and start talking about all this. So after 4 hours of taking notes, I interviewed my father for another 10 hours, and it led to this book. So that's why this book took over 51 years to actually come out. My father died this past October at the age of 91. And over the next 8 days while we were sitting Shiva, I was aware that 2 other Holocaust survivors had died. One by the name of Abraham Jakubowicz, who was from Germany, and Malka Zeitz, who was from Poland, and both were 101. We all know that in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be few, if any, Holocaust survivors left. And this very hostile and anti-Semitic environment in which we all live, both England and the United States and all over the world, the further we get away from the Holocaust and the fewer survivors that there are, it makes your job, people who are watching this today, and my job much, much more difficult. We have too little Holocaust education going on in the United States and probably in England as well. And without that education, I think we're all aware of the fact that on social media, you can pretty much say and do whatever you want. And there are too many millions of people who peddle in Holocaust denial on a daily basis. So my father was born in Velichka, which was a little town of about 8,000 people, 8 miles southeast of Krakow. Krakow, of course, was the center of Jewish life in Poland, and it was known for its salt mine. This photo that I have in the book, this is the center square of the city, and this is about from 1930. And the reason why I have this photo in the book is because on September 1st, the Germans invaded Poland, but by the 5th, they were in my father's town of Velichka. And over the next 5 days, they engaged in a ritual where they would round up Jewish men and make them sweep the city square. And as you can see, the city square was mostly dirt and poor cobblestone. And in this photo, it's hard to see, but there's a row of German soldiers behind the Jews that have been lined up with brooms and shovels. And at least on my computer at home, they're all laughing, grinning, and you can see German trucks behind. Probably the reason why the Germans started to do this on September 5th, besides the obvious that they were humiliating the Jews and forcing the local Jews to watch, was they were trying to soften them up. Nobody knew what genocide would be or would look like. No one really understood the concept, but the Germans sure did. So they were trying to showcase themselves as abusers, but that they wouldn't go any further than that. But very slowly, over the next 5 days, these types of scenes would play out in the center square of my father's town. They would first target the observant or Orthodox Jews and make them sweep up virtually nothing. And because there were so many German horses, they would force Jews to pick up the manure with their bare hands and either put it in their pockets or in a bucket. And if you're wondering who took these pictures, it's the Wehrmacht, of course. As you may or may not know, Hitler intended not only to wipe out world Jewry, but he intended to create a museum after winning the war to showcase the good work that he had done in eliminating world Jewry. So many German soldiers were charged with taking video and photos, and while the Germans destroyed much remained. And I actually found a cache belonging to a Jewish Pole in Białystok, Poland, and he permitted me to have these photos that are specific to my father's town. Here's another example of what was going on in my father's town. Again, sometime between September 5th and the 12th, German soldiers cutting the payas off of an Orthodox Jew. My father witnessed all of this. The local Polish population would gather around and laugh and have a good time at the Jews' expense. This photo, however, is exactly dated September 12th, 1939. On this particular day, after 5 days of rounding up Jews and humiliating them, they actually intended to bring Jewish men out to a local forest and shoot and kill them. My grandfather was one of the 32 men that were dragged to the square on this day and taken to the forest and shot and killed. This is probably earlier during the roundup. It began just with Orthodox Jews. You can clearly see in the right-hand side another Orthodox Jew being pushed into the center square. And literally minutes or hours later, my grandfather was also rounded up and put here. The importance of this particular moment is, up to this point, my father would hear a German order or law or a Polish order to report somewhere or line up. But when the Germans lied on this day and said that they were taking 32 Jewish men out to a job, a hard labor job, and they ended up machine gunning them all down, my father, at the age of 9, realized nothing that the Poles, the Polish police, the Polish municipality, which played a large part in this roundup, nothing that the Nazis say I'm going to do. In fact, I will do the exact opposite. So it was already early 1940, and my dad refused to wear the mandated armband, which became law in November of 1939. My dad was short. He had blondish brown hair and blue eyes. He took advantage of the fact that he was small in size and that he, quote unquote, didn't look Jewish. And because the Germans were occupying Poland, many people in Warsaw fled, particularly Jews, and they fled to Krakow to hide. From there, many Jews fled Krakow to the southern cities, one of which was my dad's town, Waliczka. So Waliczka went from an 8,000 person town, and in early 1940, it was 20,000 people. It was overcrowded. So my dad took advantage of the fact that there were so many people walking around on a daily basis. He wouldn't wear the armband. He had blue eyes, fair skin, blondish brown hair. No one saw him. He literally would buy food for the family so that they could survive. They had no income with my grandfather already dead. The Poles would come to the door, knock on the door, and they were looking for labor for people to build the now famous labor camp Plaszow, which was featured in the Schindler's List movie. My father refused to partake in that. He would always be a few feet from the back window, and when someone would knock on the door and one of his sisters would answer, and they would say, "We need Nathan to present himself," he would slip out the back window and run away. And this is what my father did for the first 3 years of the war. Hid among the overpopulated city, would never participate in construction projects of the labor camp Plaszow, wouldn't wear the armband. Eventually in 1942, he felt that the walls were starting to close in, and he went to the local train station and went to Miechów, which is north of Krakow. And this ended up being a dry run, because what my father figured out is, without identifying himself as a Jew, he was able to actually move around quite easily. He ended up sneaking in and out of the Miechów ghetto, the Bochnia ghetto, the Krakow ghetto. And he did this actually quite easily, even though he was risking his life. At one point, when he was at the train station in his hometown, Waliczka, took a train to Miechów, and from there, death trains were coming through taking people to Auschwitz, to Berlinka, and Belzec. And those names were spray painted on the trains. And my father had no idea what those three places or three words were, but he clearly could see that the people inside were being held against their will. They were breathing heavy, they were thirsty, they were hungry, they were panicked. My dad had to show absolutely no empathy for them and no concern, because he was getting around as a Jew, posing as a non-Jew. He couldn't show any kind of concern for his fellow Jew. These are the Krakow ghetto gates that my father snuck in and out of under the cover of the Schindler Jews. My father, at the end of 42, got a job. By then, he already had his false papers, and he was walking around presenting himself as Staszek Surdel. And he got a job at a local leather shoe shop. And the Gestapo paid a visit there, and they were actually looking for somebody else. But it scared my father to death. And soon thereafter, he told the shop owner, who thought he was Staszek Surdel, "I'm really not cut out to be a shoe worker. Do you know anyone who might need a job, an assistant on a farm?" And the shoe shop owner said, "Yeah, I do." So he took him out to Babice, which is north of Krakow, way out in the country. And that's where he stayed for the next 3 years, working on a farm without any experience in how to milk cows, plant crops, harvest crops. But little did my dad know, he thought he was running away from danger of being in cities too close to the Gestapo. The farm was actually a few miles from a German outpost. And this is where this was the outpost in Babice that the Germans had reconstituted and repopulated. It was a World War I fortress, and World War II, they repopulated it and used it as a backup front line should they ever need it, if the Russians would ever push back. So my dad was told he had to bring dairy products to the German outpost here on a daily basis. So here my dad thought he was running away from danger in Krakow, and now he was even closer to it. But he had all the confidence in the world with his false papers. He had created his own narrative of how his Polish parents had died, and where his siblings were. And he had this whole backstory that he invented on his own at the age of 12. And one day when he was bringing milk to the Germans were not fond of Polish kids or Poles in general. He was drunk. He started to pick on my father, and my father kicked at the ground, and mud splattered on the German soldiers' boots. That was considered an assault on him, and my father was beaten, rendered unconscious, and put on a train, which wound up in Bergen-Belsen. He was being treated as a prisoner of war, where he peeled potatoes for a couple of weeks, but the farm owner was a drunk and no work was getting done. So he appealed to the Germans at the fortress saying, "You guys want your dairy, I need my farmhand back." So they actually pardoned my father, or they thought Staszek Surdel, and they ordered him to be taken back to Babice on the farm. But the train was accidentally rerouted to Plaszow, the very camp that my father refused to construct in 1942. So he was there for a couple of weeks and eventually freed and made his way back to the farm. And it was at this outpost where the Soviets pushed into the Nazis and eventually had them on the run all the way back to Germany. At this point, the war was over for my father. And the first thing he did was he walked to Krakow to see if he could recognize anybody, but he saw nobody. And he did this over several weeks. He literally recognized not one Jew, didn't understand what had happened. He had only heard rumors about mass genocide, but what did that mean to a now 15-year-old? Not much, without any evidence. But what he did see was nothing. There was no one there. He went back to his hometown, and again, not one Jew was left. And a few neighbors remembered him, came up to him and explained to him about the deportation of his town to Belzec, and that no one had returned except for him. And this is where he eventually made up with his his youngest sister. And she emigrated to the United States with my father and unfortunately died in the early 60s. That's what my father looked like in 1945 after the war. He's got no parents. 3 of his sisters are dead. Over 200 members of his family on his father's side were slaughtered, and dozens on his mother's side. There were no survivors other than him and his sister. And that's my dad just 3 years later in 1948. And in 1951, the United Nations and the United States worked on passing the Displaced Persons Act. And he was on a boat, the SS Washington, for New York. And there he is at the age of 21, sailing into Ellis Island. And that's probably the best picture I have of my father and I. So that's essentially my father's story, leaving out a lot of detail, which I chronicle in the book. I'm sure many people have heard about the quote unquote trauma that is hurled on second generation, such as myself. And I grew up and I didn't understand what that meant, because I felt I had a fairly normal childhood, a happy childhood. And you would never have known that my father had survived the Holocaust and witnessed so much horror. But when I was 13 and I was in the backyard playing with my brother and a very close friend, my father came out to say goodbye for the day. He was going into work and he said goodbye. And the 3 of us ignored him because we were so busy playing. He repeated himself, said, "Goodbye, guys, going to work. I'll see you later." And again, not one of us said anything to him. And as he turned to walk away to go to work, he said, "You would never have survived." And the 3 of us paused. We knew what it meant, but we didn't understand why he said it. And I was only 13. I knew that he was referring to the Holocaust and to his survival, but why would he say such a thing? Did that punishment really fit the crime of us ignoring him in that moment that we were playing? It didn't seem like it, but I didn't really dwell on it growing up. And as I say, so many people have written about the trauma on second generation children. And that really was the only moment that something was heaped on my brother and I, but I never made much of it at the time. It didn't haunt me. It didn't bother me. I figured my dad was entitled to emote whatever he might emote. I didn't understand why. Fast forward to 2019, I finally watched a 21-year-old video of my father's USC Shoah Foundation testimony. And at the end of the 4 hours, the interviewer asked him to sum up and just kind of free float some thoughts and feelings. And my dad got a little bitter and began emoting things that he lost and didn't have. And he said, "I had my childhood stolen from me." And that finally made sense to me, that my father didn't have a childhood. He had to survive a childhood. And I thought, what a horrible thing. Most Jewish children died, and my father didn't. So he could only focus on what was taken from him, and that was his childhood. So I think in that moment, he saw 3 little Jewish boys playing so fervently, and you can call it jealousy or envy, but it definitely triggered something in him. And I dare say the only negative thing he ever said to my brother and I don't think you would have ever survived. But it took me to 2019 to figure out where that came from. And that's where it came from, because he saw the childhood that my brother and I were enjoying, and he didn't have it. So I want to leave you with a quote from the late, great Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. May his memory be a blessing. He said this: "The Shoah survivors are among the most inspiring I have had the privilege to meet. Remarkably, despite coming eyeball to eyeball with the angel of death, despite the unimaginable losses each of them suffered, So many of them fulfilled the words of Moses' great command, Uvarcharta b'chaim, choose life. In doing so, Rabbi Sachs said, survivors chose life not just for themselves, but for their children, grandchildren, and all future generations. Thank you so much for having me this evening. I really appreciate your attendance.
Thank you very, very much, Joel. Very moving. I've read the book, and of course it's remarkable. We'd like to ask questions, and if I may, I'd like to start off with the first and potentially the second and the third if nobody else has got any others. But you just talked about the influence of your father and the length of time and so on it took. What did you learn from your dad's survival that shaped you into the person that you are today?
I think my dad's number one trait was resilience. I don't know if a 9 to 15-year-old could have done what my dad did, or any other young boy or girl that survived. I'm sure flight survivors had very similar stories to my father. He just quietly resists evil and hard times. And that was the house that I grew up in. Nothing could ever get my dad down. I think all he ever wanted in life was a roof over his head and a warm house, something that he didn't have for 6 years. And that was the environment that I was raised in, to take nothing for granted. And even the smallest things mean so much because he never had it.
I'm going to, so if I'd suggest if you could unmute everyone so that they can ask questions. Whilst you're doing that, if I can just follow on with one further question. Did your father actually come from a religious background in terms of his family? And my kind of follow-on question from that is, what was his belief following survival? Because of course that's a huge subject.
Those are important questions. So in Velichka, there were, I don't know if it was called the Reform movement, but there was definitely a more secular form of Judaism in Velichka. Then there was the ultra-religious Orthodox. I would best characterize my father and his family as conservadox by today's vernacular. I don't think that phrase existed in the 20s and 30s, but they were Shomer Shabbos, they kept kosher. They didn't go to shul 7 days a week, but they went every Friday night and Saturday. So they were, you know, like I say, conservadox. My mother was fairly reformed, and my dad raised my brother and I as conservative Jews growing up. We went to conservative Hebrew day schools. But my dad worked 6 out of 7 days to make a living. So he would pretty much just go to shul on Passover, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. But it was important to him that his sons went. And early on, my brother and I were daily minyan kids because we went to Hebrew day school. So he wasn't so religious, but it was important to him that his 2 boys went to Hebrew private schools, learned Hebrew, Talmud Torah, fluent in Hebrew, and kept all the holidays in the house. So that was important to him, but in practice, he was busy working.
Yeah. Anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? I can't, I'm on sort of speaker's view, so I can't see everyone. I can obviously come in with a further one. My wife, Esther, she's in the same house and is massively capable of asking questions because she has a master's in Holocaust studies.
But I'm leaving it to you.
And I know Julian Pollard is here, and he's a sensational questioner. So whoever would like to ask, please do.
Can I chip in?
Yes, please do.
Joel, firstly, thank you for a very interesting discussion, and the book sounds fascinating. You touched upon the ignorance about the awareness of the younger generation, both in your country and in ours, of Holocaust facts and Holocaust denial. I think I read somewhere that 63% of the American population have little known or knowledge of the Holocaust. They certainly don't have the relevant facts to hand. Why is that in the light of stories like your father's, films that we've seen over recent years about the Holocaust? Why do you think that is?
All I know is that out of 50 states in the United States, only 18 states have mandatory Holocaust education. Why is that? Ignorance, laziness. Unfortunately, I think we're deep into a me, look at me, social media influencer type life in the Western world, unfortunately. And I think the more serious the subject, the more facts you give, the more living memorials you give. It seems to be boring to the 15 to 35-year-old crowd these days. They seem much more interested in electronics, social media. So I think that's had a terrible, terrible negative impact. But for the 18 states here that actually do have it, they actually do have good curriculum. I'm going to be participating in a symposium later this year in Atlanta, Georgia, that a fellow Jew has put together to actually teach teachers how to present the Holocaust to grades K through 12. It's mostly going to be run by PhDs and masters in Holocaust education people, but I've been invited to come to give context. There aren't very many survivors to have show up to such a symposium, but at least I can stand there and say, I'm the son of a survivor, and here's my father's story, to make it more real to teachers. And obviously the teachers who show up at this symposium aren't the ones that you need to convince, because they are convinced. Yeah, I think the extreme freedoms we have in Western Europe and the United States and Canada has led to a malaise. And like I say, I don't think people are really engaged with serious subjects anymore, like my generation and your generation came up with.
I mean, I don't mean this as a criticism.
It can be addressed, and hopefully it will be.
I don't mean this in any way as a criticism, but I think it's a fact that a large majority of Americans have never left the States, and many of them don't even have passports. And is it the fact then, because of that, they just don't have any interest or awareness of the outside world? Europe is a long way away. What happened in Europe 75 years ago is of very little interest to them now. And the politics of today means that, why should they? The isolationist policies of some American politicians means that it's of certainly no interest to get involved in the history, let alone the present problems we have in Europe and other countries.
You're unfortunately 110% correct. There's a huge disinterest in this country, and Europe being so far away, it being so far away to take a trip to Germany and eastern parts of Europe, particularly Poland, to see what's left and what happened. You're right. There's a lack of interest. People don't go to museums so much here in the United States anymore. That's just too boring to today's 15 to 35-year-olds. And that would include going to Europe to do any kind of a non-Holocaust or a Holocaust education tour. It's unfortunate, but nipping it in the bud K through 12 here in the United States is the only way forward. If you can get students to engage early, perhaps they will be interested as adults to go to Europe and see firsthand what's left and make it more real.
Thank you.
But you're right to pick up on what by innuendo about the sad state of affairs of politics in the United States. You almost become shamed in the United States for talking about the Holocaust, because the media and politicians here have somehow equated white privilege with, if you're Jewish, you really shouldn't speak out about the horrors of your own people. And that's the state of affairs here, that talking about the Holocaust as a white second generation person is somehow, it doesn't fit in with today's social movements. So what you touched on is huge. Yes.
Can I just say something?
Sure, of course.
Hi. Just to say that I'm with Simon in another room. I've been a Holocaust educator for about 20 years in this country. It is part of the national curriculum. Year 9s have to learn about it. There has been a lot of studies about how much they actually absorb and whether they carry on learning about it later on in life. But certainly Jewish schools teach it, and there's a lot of trips from here to Europe as part of the sixth form curriculum. March of the Living does amazing work with getting people to Europe and on the, learning about the Holocaust as well. And I work at the Imperial War Museum, which has Holocaust, a very new Holocaust gallery that is amazing in terms of education. The problem has been the pandemic and getting people to the museums at the moment. And the schools have stopped going so much, but it is part of the national curriculum. And hopefully, once everything gets a bit more back to normal, people will, be going more from schools and be learning much more about it. Certainly, your kind of a book is often, in the bookshop there. If you can get it in the bookshop in the Imperial War Museum, then that's a way of promoting your father's story, and that would be a good way. And obviously, there's a lot of online courses as well about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, which I know the UCL does a lot of those, and Yad Vashem. So there are many ways that it can be promoted. But you're right that there is an apathy amongst 13 to 15-year-olds, particularly, about learning about the atrocities of the past. Also, just one more thing, we do have a Holocaust Memorial Day here. I don't know if you do in the States, at the end of January, to the same day as the liberation of Auschwitz. And there it is a national Holocaust Memorial Day. And at the same time, you're remembering genocides from, say, Rwanda, Cambodia, and other genocides. So when you talk about a white person's kind of, they equate it with white person's privilege, and Jewish people only like trying to highlight their causes. That way they are trying to highlight other atrocities as well that were classified as genocides. So that's another way of trying to promote interest in it.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I sent our son and daughter to Hebrew day schools as well. And almost all Hebrew day schools today in the United States, probably in England and France as well, they send kids to do a Poland-Israel trip. It's the non-Jews public school K through 12 that obviously don't. If anything, the only trip that they'll push is a trip to Washington, D.C. or New York here in the United States, because it's way less expensive. But yeah, they'll take trips to local Holocaust museums. But picking up on something you said, Esther, my book has been accepted into only one non-Holocaust, non-Jewish museum in Germany. Other than that, only Jewish Holocaust museums have accepted the book, which is great, but really? It's hard to get exposure in non-Jewish museums.
I can try and expose it for you if you want.
That'd be great. That would be great.
I can't guarantee it, but I'll try.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Let me just jump in with a quick question in a few parts. The first is, I'm very aware of the American Society for Yad Vashem, which is actually very powerful, very strong, hugely funded. My question to you is, how connected are you with them? They're based in New York and LA. Have you ever yourself been to Poland and spent time there? Do you go to Yad Vashem in Israel?
I've been to Israel once. I've been to Yad Vashem. They accepted my book in their collection, which is not an easy feat to achieve. No, I'm not connected to Yad Vashem in New York or LA. Just you guys in the UK so far.
Well, just to jump in there, I will happily, I know from the chairman, Larry Wilf, to a whole load of people who are involved there, I will happily make that introduction, and I'm sure they'll be in touch with you, yeah. And you've been to Poland?
No, I have not. I had one trip scheduled in 2017 that was canceled. I've been highly encouraged to come. It would be, my father refused to ever return. That was a absolute no, don't even discuss it with me type of issue. It would be very difficult to go. Seeing the camps and Warsaw and Krakow, that would be easier for me, but going to my father's town would be very difficult. I know what happened at the square, the photographs that I have, and if I showed you pictures of what it looks like today, you would be blown away. It's all commercialized. You wouldn't even know what happened there. There's no monuments or plaques to what happened there. Many, if not most Polish cities have no monuments or plaques to what happened. When the 32 men, including my grandfather, were rounded up and shot on September 12, 1939, when the bodies were brought back to Velichka, it was Erev Rosh Hashanah, and the city had become a city without men. Most men had fled, and the ones that were still there were dead. And the only people to bury the 32 men were women and children. And none of the Poles would help because they were either anti-Semitic or they didn't want to help Jews because fearing for their own life from the Germans. There was a plaque put up after they were buried on Erev Rosh Hashanah, but after the war, the local Poles destroyed it, and they destroyed the monument that was put up. And it wasn't the Soviets that did it, it was the Poles. So it would be very difficult for me to go to that town and walk where I know those 32 Jewish men were buried, and it's been paved over. People walk on top of it. It's, it would be hard to go there.
Awesome. Yeah.
But I do think I need to, for some kind of measure of closure. And there are some things I would want to achieve in Krakow and Warsaw. So it's definitely on my list of to-dos.
Doing work beforehand is important. I've been to Warsaw many times, and in more recent times, you would not believe the extent of redevelopment of that city. Krakow, of course, is very close to Auschwitz-Birkenau. There are different, Majdanek is one of the very few where actually there's a lot you can still see because it was not utterly destroyed as most of the others were. But yes, you need to plan it carefully, yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions? You got one, Esther? No, okay, I do. A question for you. What happened to you mentioned your father's sister, Felicia, and a reconnection, but what actually happened to her and how did they reconnect?
When my father went back to his town and he was looking for anyone, and there were not one Jew came back. His sister also came back a little bit after, and they literally ran into each other. My father had been back to his family home, and Poles had already moved in and they knew who he was, and they were very angry that he survived. The woman that answered the door said, "Why are you still here?" And so my dad walked around, spent a few weeks in his town, and literally one day as the sun was setting, he looked over his shoulder, he had a feeling, and he saw the outlines, dark silhouette of a female, and he just kept staring. And as she moved out of the sunlight, he saw it was his sister, who he hadn't seen in 3 years, and they embraced, they shared their stories. She had it a little bit easier than my father in that she was able to be placed as Zosia Surdel as a maid in a Polish home, and they had no suspicions about her being Jewish. And even though the Gestapo had picked her up, they believed her to be not Jewish. She eventually returned from the Gestapo interrogation, and she stayed there for the next 3 years, unharmed, fairly safe in a house, doing domestic work. And in 1951, she came with my father to New York, and as I say, she died in 1961 of uterine cancer. So I never met her. But yeah, she had no idea that my father was on a farm because they had to be split up. It was safer to keep them split up so that they didn't spill any sibling emotion. So yeah.
I mean, the thought of a young boy who's been circumcised having to worry every day about the obvious exposure that a revelation would reveal. I mean, it's unthinkable. The extent of how he must have been worried every single day.
Yeah, I'm looking at a comment from Yvonne Cheney, and I am affiliated with the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. They accepted my book. here in Southern California. Just wanted to throw that out.
Good. Yeah, agreed. Anyone else have questions for Joel, or any other questions?
Yeah, can I ask one more question, actually? How did your father find the experience of giving the testimony to the Shoah Foundation?
As I said earlier, he was liberated. It was the first time he had talked about it since 1945. So that's 43 years of silence. He cried through most of the 4 hours. It was very, very difficult on him. But afterwards, he was the happiest guy in the world that he got it out. And as I said at the beginning, he then wanted to talk to anybody that would listen to him. But I shut down.
Yeah.
And just by way of background, I don't know why, but as the eldest of two brothers, I took it upon myself at an early age to one day tell my father's story. And during my Devar Torah at my bar mitzvah, I boldly said that to the congregation. I said, one day I will tell my father's story. And I was 13. I had no idea what that would entail, what I would have to go through emotionally, intellectually to get to that point. It took a long time. But it had to be when both my father was ready and I was ready at the same time. And even though he was ready for 21 years when I was shut down, it is what it is. And it took a long time, but it eventually happened.
Yeah. Did you feel that the interviewer was well trained in asking the right questions? Did you hear when you watched the interview afterwards?
If I'm being critical, I would say no. I guess I'm an attorney, so I would be very critical of any inquisitor or questioner or interviewer. She let him free flow think and speak for probably too many hours without interrupting and asking a direct follow-up detailed question that I was able to do, 21 years later, face to face. But I don't know what her background was or how the interviewers were selected by the Spielberg Shoah Foundation at that time. But I if you watched it, if you get access to it online, you would, I think with most of the interviews, you'd probably have the same reaction as me. This would be a good time for a follow-up question. Oh, you didn't ask it. But it's easy to be critical, after the fact. And as the son of the interviewer, I definitely was. But I think that was good because it sparked my own follow-up questions. So I didn't need to redo the 4 hours of testimony that I already heard. And I had my own version of questions and follow-ups. So there was definitely value in what that interviewer did, but it could have been better, to be frank, with answering.
No, that's very interesting for me because I did a dissertation on oral survivor testimonies and I studied the Shoah Foundation a lot. And a lot of what you're saying resonated with a lot of second generation of survivors, that they felt the interviewers were not that well trained, and also that they always wanted to end up with a happy ending. And
Yes.
it wasn't necessarily so for a lot of survivors, that even though they had survived and they'd made lives for themselves, etc., they still felt very, very broken inside. And
you raise a huge issue there. At the very end, when she asked my father to kind of free think and sum up, my dad was very negative, very bitter. He said the Poles didn't do enough to save Jews, and obviously they did. There's more Poles in the righteous of the living at Yad Vashem, but in my book I explain that's really mathematics, since most of the Holocaust took place in Poland and there were so many millions of Jews there. Statistically, there's going to be more good Poles that help out. So I put that in context in the book. But my father's experience was pretty bad in his town, as it was for so many Jews. So my dad's interview ended on a down note because that's how he felt. His family was taken away from him and murdered. He's 9 years old, 12 years old. It's not a happy ending, other than he survived and created his own Jewish life and Jewish family, yes. But yeah, his interview ends in a realistic way. but you're right. The interviewer did try to make it more Pollyanna.
Yeah.
But my dad wouldn't go there because he was speaking from the heart, and he said what he said and talked about having his childhood stolen from him. So, yeah.
So that was really good that you watched it and then did your own interview, really, because then you got much more of the truth, probably.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to hear you say, I mean, you're an expert, you're educated in this field, that you say a lot of second generation have the same critique that I just gave of the interviewer. In fairness to the foundation, their work was indispensable. Obviously, it got out, it got recorded. But being objective, yeah, I agree. For me as a second generation, it could have been a better interview. So it's interesting to hear you say that, because I never heard anyone say that. But from the few that I've watched, in addition to my father, I felt the same way. Like, I don't know where they found the interviewers, but thank God they found people to do it. But your finding is accurate. They probably weren't well trained. I don't know how they found them. I don't know what
they had a target after Schindler's List. They had a target that they wanted to. I can't even remember now. So I did my dissertation 20 years ago, but they had a target of interviewing X amount of survivors by the year 2000.
Right.
And so it meant that a lot of people were trained very quickly in the process and not necessarily well trained.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I would agree with you that was the feeling I had too. Right.
Okay.
We usually commit for this to last 1 hour, which gives us about 2 minutes. So I'd just like to, prior to saying a huge thank you and to winding up, did your dad know that the book was published?
Yeah. When I came back from Israel in 2018, I told him I was going to finally do it, that I was ready to do it. I started writing it during the COVID lockdown in March of 2020. And I updated him almost every day. I'm on this chapter, I'm on this chapter. And when I had a first draft, I put it on an iPad. I had all the photos and I handed it to him, and he went through it. He paid close attention to the table of contents, and he liked the flow. He felt it represented his life and his story. And then, you know, he was not doing well. And when I handed him a physical copy of the book, because it was published, he was aware of it, but he was sort of too far gone to really appreciate it. But the important thing is that he knew I was writing it and I had finished the first draft. And when I told him I had a publisher, he was much, you know, he was still okay. He understood that. He was like, oh, that's great. So, yeah.
Well done. A huge thank you to you. Really appreciate it. I know from some of the comments that you've received online how much we've all really appreciated it. Fantastic to hear from you. I will put you in touch with the American Society, and we will do. Esther, I know will. If I was a betting man, I'd say the odds are in favour of your book being admitted at the Imperial War Museum, but we'll see.
Not up to me.
No, well recommended. Just for everyone else who's listening, our next book club event is going to be with Lily Ebbert and her grandson Dov, when we'll be reviewing Lily's Promise, How I Survived Auschwitz and Found the Strength to Live. It's going to be at the end of next month, but we're going to circulate the date when it's confirmed. So at this point, it is 9 o'clock. So a good night to everyone. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Sari.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Yad Vashem UK Foundation, and I'll be at the Lily Ebert one for sure.
Beautiful. Okay, good night, everyone.